So maybe give us your overall sort of view on probiotics, how you use them, and then sort of just the longevity of every single day using the same one, and not giving any time to see what happens with your gut when you're not taking probiotics.
Yeah. Well, the sort of principle I follow clinically is we want to use treatments until we get someone to a point where they have little to no symptoms, and then they've been stable there for at least a month, ideally 2 or 3. And then we do two things. We broaden the diet. I like doing that first because that seems to have the biggest impact psychosocially. I can go out to dinner. I'm not worried about the menu. I'm not grilling the waiter about, how the oils are used or whatever. I'm more resilient. I'm more robust. So the first thing I like to do, broaden the diet. Once we get stability there with sort of hopefully this newfound food freedom, then we start peeling back the supplements and we look for the minimal effective dose or the minimal effective program, which is a really important principle because there is this drift toward more, 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 right? So, we do want to be on the back end trying to weed and reduce. There are some data points showing that if you discontinue a probiotic too early, you can see a regression. This is a wonderful study by Quigley and colleagues. They gave people a probiotic, they monitored their IBS symptoms, and they also monitored over time their cortisol awakening response, which is probably the most accurate way to measure cortisol output. And it's a beautiful visual. And this, we've discussed this on a few of our YouTube videos, but what you see over time is at baseline, they have a blunted or a low amount of cortisol release. Then they start the probiotics. A month in, their cortisol output is improved. 2 months in, it's even better. Then they stop. There's a washout period. Month 3, cortisol levels are going down. Month 4, cortisol levels are back to near baseline subpar. So that's only a 2-month intervention, but it does make the point that if you discontinue a therapy too early, you can have a regression. Where that line is probably going to be different for different people, right? So I think coming back to symptoms, we want to have that bigger picture objective of broad diet, minimal supplements. But as part of that experiment to determine what your minimal effective plan would be, come off your probiotics and then see how you do. Do you notice 2 or so months later, bowels start to get more loose, you're more constipated? I think that's the best way to approach this. Getting these in from your diet, also really important. And we did a video review, a podcast review on this a few months back, which was eye-opening for me in terms of you can get adequate probiotic from foods, from fermented foods. And we created a table where we just go side by side with various foods next to a supplement, and they're on par. So you can obtain a similar dose via food as you can from a supplement. So I would favor the foods, other than those who might notice are histamine sensitive and they just don't tolerate too much of an intake of these fermented foods. There's one study so I guess zooming out, what about healthy people? Because that partially also answers your question, right? Do healthy people benefit? Otherwise, healthy people benefit from probiotics. One study in nurses found they had better mood and improved empathy scores when using a probiotic. So they weren't depressed, they were normal mood, but they had even better mood and empathy from a probiotic intervention. And then another study in otherwise healthy individuals found that probiotic supplementation increased glutathione levels. So there might be a little bit of a case for longer term, but I think when it's done in the paradigm of you're attempting to find the minimal effective dose and you're not expecting the probiotic to be necessary in the long term. And there's the categories, but I guess I'll pause there for a second before we jump in on that.
No, I mean, I think just make a comment on, these different sort of, because people don't know about probiotics, I don't like to keep someone exactly on the same unless they're doing well and it really helped them and it's broad spectrum. But taking plantarum the whole time, we've got immune booster ones, and some of the research shows that it can improve sort of immunity. They've done well, and then including the Saccharomyces boulardii. And I know there are 3 types or 3 subsets. Maybe you want to explain that and where you start using probiotics. I think that's really important. People are sort of they're unaware of how the quality as well, and shelf stabilized, and should it be in the fridge. I think give us some perspective there.
Yeah. A lot of great stuff there to speak to. One thing that I find interesting, and this is in part hypothesis on my side, but most probiotics don't lead to long-term colonization. Some do colonize, but many do not. But rather, they seem to have this transient impact where they stimulate your immune system. Specifically, there's one receptor in particular that I find pretty important, TLR4, toll-like receptor 4. This regulates LPS, or leaky gut particle response, but probiotics can also attenuate the function of that receptor. So they do so in a transient fashion. They pass through almost like tourists, right? If there's a city that people really love to visit, tourists come in, they spend money, they feed the economy, and then they move on. So you need this flow of tourists to spend money in the local economy, or this flow of probiotics to stimulate receptors in the gut from an immune perspective. As it pertains to shelf-stable or enteric-coated, the most seminal meta-analysis was by Zorzella and colleagues. Fascinating study. They took probiotics, they heated them up to kill them, what's known as heat-killed probiotics. And they found that the heat-killed probiotics were essentially as effective as live, intact probiotics. And this might reinforce the immune component, where the dead probiotic still triggers that immune receptor. It's less prone to colonize you, but still has an immunomodulatory impact. So I do think the enteric coated or the refrigerator pack probably doesn't really matter like we used to think a number of years ago. Then in terms of, there's so many products out there, how do we provide some sort of heuristic? The way I look at this is there's 3 different types of probiotics. One is actually not even a bacteria, it's a fungus. This is your Saccharomyces, so Saccharomyces boulardii or Saccharomyces cerevisiae. These both have pretty good research showing benefit for a number of conditions. There's your traditional type. You hit some of these earlier, like Lactobacillus plantarum, Bifidobacterium infantis. And what you see in these formulas is a blend of different Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium species. And then third and finally, you have your soil-based, which is usually one or a few different bacillus species. There's going to be variability, but as we've really created data tables where we look at different formulas comparatively, you see similar benefits for different formulas, making me conclude that generally speaking, the action or the benefit from probiotics is not very species or strain specific.